This video was produced by
Welcome everybody to the Institute for Visual Studies. My name is Daniel Robinson. I'm the Assistant Director of IVS, and we're all here to see, of course, Rebecca Silberman talk about her work. And I thought I would take a minute to introduce Rebecca and some of her accomplishments. We'll be seeing her work in just a few minutes, and you'll see how interesting and wonderful it really is. On a personal note, Rebecca was my thesis advisor in grad school, so I spent many hours in her office talking about my work to her, and she listened very graciously and gave me a lot of comments. So it's nice to get more than a passing word or two about her own stuff, so I'm very excited. But Rebecca is the Associate Professor of Art, and she's been at JMU since 2005. She teaches photography at all levels in different formats and types. She has exhibited and lectured on her work widely, all over the country and internationally.
Not yet.
I'm
working on that.
Upcoming things for Rebecca, she will be showing work that she's doing as a part of a collaborative group called the Metal Shed Collab with Karine Jope and Demph DeWild, who are both in this room. So that's very exciting. We'll talk about it. At the Beverly Street Gallery in 2016, that focuses on imagery from a book called Housekeeping, which is also very wonderful. Rebecca recommended it to me years ago, and I read it dutifully, and it was as good as she said. So that's very exciting. Also this summer, Rebecca will be taking students to Prague to study photography as well. And just as a bit of context, we're teaching right now, as most of you probably know, IVS focuses primarily on interdisciplinary team taught classes, and our class that we have going right now is called the Object of Play, which I'm actually teaching with a philosopher, and we focus on play theory from a philosophical and religious standpoint, while also making toys, board games, and a variety of other objects with which one plays. So Rebecca, we thought Rebecca's work would kind of fit in there pretty well, and I'll let her elaborate more. But Rebecca Silberman.
Okay. Thank you all. This is great. So I'm going to start with some ideas that are out of this book called On Longing, and it's by Susan Stewart, Narratives of the Miniature, the Gigantic, the Souvenir, the Collection. Really wonderful book. But she talks about toys. She talks about the playground as sort of the space of social play, and then she talks about toys as the space of sort of fantasy play and internal play, mental play. My work has sort of been moving in that direction. The camera is always, I think, sort of present. It's always sort of implied in the work because there's always the lens, but I'm fascinated by miniatures because I think basically photographic images are almost always, our experience of them is always as this kind of miniature facsimile. And so I don't really think it's a huge stretch to sort of become very intrigued by just the idea of optics and this tiny stage and then these toys. But then because David and Daniel asked me to do this talk, I really started looking back, like, what are my real influences? What's the stuff that's really influenced me the most? And surprisingly enough, I have these things that I've had around me forever. And I don't know that you can see the details. Hopefully you can. But this is a little music box. It's a Rouge music box. It's made in Switzerland. It's not mine. It was my sister's. And it was always kept at my grandmother's house. And when I was little, I was absolutely fascinated with this. And so I was trying to wrap my mind around, why was this such a perfect thing? And did I ever really believe she was real? And I don't think I believed she was real exactly, but she occupied some space in between toy and being real, because what happens is when you turn this music box on, this beautiful music plays, it's mechanical, she bounces up and down and she turns around and she's balanced so that she actually will do these spins in this really unpredictable way and her legs sort of fly out. She still really fascinates me. Every once in a while I put this on and look at it, and I'm like, it still is such incredible genius. Of course, it's made in Switzerland, so it's very, very finely made and balanced. I don't know that this company exists anymore, but So when I was little, I climbed up on a desk or something to get this thing down, and I just had to get this thing out of there, because if I loved something when I was little, I pretty much destroyed it. I think I was about 3, and I was trying to think, is that credible to say 3? Because I've had a psychologist tell me that most children don't have memories before 6. But I know that I do, because I had a big event in my life at 5, which was the death of my mother. And I know my pre-death memories, and I know my after ones. So I think I was about 3 years old, and I got this down, and I started wailing on it. That's the bruise that's on the top and the cracks that are down the side, because I was going to get this little doll out of here. I had to see her. And my grandmother came in, because she was clairvoyant, and she said, "That's not yours." And she put it up on a little higher shelf, which is actually a recipe for disaster around me, because I would have gone for it. But anyway, somehow she discouraged me. This went into storage for many years. My dad got remarried, and his wife said, "Everybody come get their boxes out of the basement." And it just so happened, this was in my 30s, I went and got my box and looked over. There was my sister's box. I'm like, I wonder what's in my sister's box. I opened it up. There it is. I'm like, I don't think she'll mind if I borrow this. And so it's been mine ever since. I love this thing. And every little girl I show this to loves this thing. And it's, I'm immediate best friends with them. So this has been a big thing to me. I love this thing still. In 2010, Tate invited me to go to Vienna, and this is another thing that a very early influence, surprisingly enough. This is a painting from a book on symbolism that I've had since high school, and I always really loved this painting. And frankly, there are disturbing things about it, of course. I always just ignored the disturbing stuff. I love this woman. She doesn't have an unpleasant look on her face. Looks like she's kind of sleeping. And in fact, this has been compared to images of people asleep, the ones that supposedly illustrate sleep paralysis, where the woman's asleep and she's got, you guys probably know it, the demon on her chest. She's got this kind of blissful look on her face. And so the other sort of unpleasant stuff about this painting I always just ignored. Every time I see a paper bag stuck in a tree, blowing in a tree, it always makes me think of this painting. And when I went to Vienna, Tate's wife, Kaki, very kindly took me around for sort of a day of grown-up activities. And she took me to the Belvedere Museum. And in my book, that is not where this was said to be located. The book is from the 70s, or maybe early 80s. And so where it was a place that was going to take me sort of way out of my way. And I just determined I probably wasn't going to see it. But Kaki took me to the Belvedere. And I walked around this corner, and I saw this painting. And I think my eyes just filled up with tears. I was so astonished by it, to see it in real life. I totally did not expect to see it. I sat in that room for like an hour, and I watched other people's reactions to it, and it was pretty amazing. Other people did the same thing. They just walked the corner, and they just sort of gasped. Really amazing. I think that one of the things that's so amazing is everybody comments about the fact that this basically looks very unfinished as a painting. There are spaces over here where you could see through to the canvas. And so it looked very, very unfinished, but it so fully conveys this kind of feeling of coldness. But also Segantini, if you read up on him at all, is sort of credited with being the first painter who made the leap from this sort of realistic depiction into dream imagery. So he's a precursor to the surrealists. And his stuff beyond that creates these incredible moods. But most scholarly stuff that I looked at tends to really focus on the work that he did prior to this, because I think this is kind of disturbing stuff for people. Again, I always just sort of ignored what I didn't really like out of these. And then after I went, that year I came home and I felt like I had to do something related to the Vienna trip. And I'd been building these miniatures. And so I had this partially made doll. Her backbone, it's hard to see here, shows the teeth of, I think this is maybe a possum. It's pretty small. And then this bone is what would have been around the eye. And she's very small. It uses my hair. I had her mostly made. These types of weird things happen with me. I had her mostly made, and then I just basically made her head. And I was like, whoa, this is that painting perfectly. And so you see that she's viewed through a lens. And she's got her hair tangled. These are called like Helping Hands. My friend Martha gave me the first one of these. I think Greg has given me one, and now I have like a stockpile of these things. I love them. So they're magnifying glasses. They hold whatever you put in front of the magnifying glass, and then you can really examine. I think it's fly fishermen and crafters use it. I always use it in the finished work. And again, this sort of refers to the camera. And so, yeah, she's really small, about 2 inches, about that big. She's miniature. She is that doll, right? But she's also that thing in the painting. After I did this, this book, Resurfaces, this is going back to play. This book, oh my gosh, I read this. It came out in '72. I read this probably when I was anywhere from 8 to 10 years old. Has anybody ever read this book? Oh my God, is it the best book ever? Yes, it's amazing because it won a Newbery Award, and when my daughter brought home a Newbery Award winner, and I read it, and I was like, whoa, this is great. So I started researching Newbery Award winners, and I found this book again, and I read it to my daughter, and I realized, man, I swallowed this book whole. Everything that's in this book is inside of me and is emerging, especially now that my daughter is about the age that I was when I read this. And so even though I'd already made that little strange bone doll, and lots of people were like, whoa, this is pretty weird for you, Rebecca. And I was just trying to, I'm like, yeah, I know it's weird. I don't really know where it comes from. But I really just think it comes from this book, basically. Because this girl, Julie or Mayax, she's Eskimo. She lives, she's being taken care of by her father after her mother dies. And he's teaching her, all of the Eskimo skills that she needs to survive. And then he sort of disappears on a hunting trip. She ends up with this family where she's going to school. She's kind of making these little handcrafts, which is a little bit demeaning, but she doesn't really mind doing it. And then kind of the kicker is that when she's 13 years old, she gets married off. And this family that she gets married into, because she really has no status, is not a good family. I mean, it represents all the worst things that happen to Native American populations when they are disconnected from their own culture. So the stepfather's an alcoholic, and her husband is kind of, he's actually, they call him feeble-minded. I don't think they would use that word anymore, but he's not, it's bleak. The situation's bleak. And so she decides, she's heard rumors of her father living in this other place in Alaska, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and she just packs her bag and goes. And it was thought at the time that this was written that this was not a very credible book, because the way she survives is, first of all, she just survives off of the skills her father has taught her. And one of the things that she does, and this is one thing I really remember doing a lot when I was around 9 or 10 years old, is that initially she survives just by eating the tender ends of grass. That's how she survives, is just eating, she forages. And I ate a lot of grass when I was little, a lot of tender ends of grass, and I also canned a lot of sorrel, which I taught myself about. I only learned that it was called sorrel as an adult. I called it pickleweed. I don't know if you guys have ever tasted it. It looks like little pickles grow on it. I canned that stuff like crazy when I was little, and I buried it all over my parents' yard as a nice surprise for whoever bought the house after them. So, yeah, I did a lot of that stuff when I was little. And now this is huge again in my life. My daughter she goes to this school called the Living Earth School. It's a camp, but she does these year-round things with this camp, and one of the things they teach them to do is foraging. And as soon as she came home and started showing me some foraging, man, that just lit a fire in me. And it's huge. That's a huge thing in our lives now, is foraging and knowing what grows around us. So anyway, the trajectory of this story is that she also befriends these wolves, and it's actually, she uses all the language. This is something her father's taught her, to watch the animals. This is for, hunting, to think like the animals, to hunt. But she thinks like the animals to survive. And so she befriends these. And it's fortunate that she takes off in the spring, because she thinks this is going to give her enough time to make it all the way across the tundra to get to her dad. And so she befriends the puppies. When the adult dogs go out for the hunt, she befriends the puppies. And she follows them on, they're following the caribou, and she's following them. And this is really how she's surviving. But I think one of the very interesting things that happens is that, and this is such a great literary device, at a certain point, and I got chills when I reread this, she's picked up one of the bones that one of the puppies has been chewing on, and she wants to make a comb, because she's always been this kind of neat person. but as she's living in the tundra, she's sort of always disheveled, and she's got to make a comb out of it. And this is one of the things that is a marvel of this book, too. She's not depressed. She's never frightened. She's always telling herself stories. She's always watching and observant and collecting. And it's not just survival. It's beyond that. I mean, it's this kind of heightened thing, if you read between the lines. But then, right as she's getting closer to this town, she's been with the dogs for a long time, and she's pretty accepted by them. One of the things she does is she doesn't walk upright until she realizes that she's been fully accepted by them. So she remains a submissive member of their society. Again, this is all really credible. But then one night as she's sitting in her camp, as she carved, she saw that it was not a comb at all, but Amarok, which is the alpha dog. The teeth were his legs, the handle his head. He was waiting to be released from the bone. Surprised to see him, she carved carefully for hours, and finally she let him out. His neck was arched, his head and his tail were lifted. Even his ears had a message. And so almost as soon as she does this, her comb, which is this practical item that she thinks she's making, turns into this amulet. Almost as soon as this happens, she's getting to the outskirts of town, and a plane flies over, and somebody shoots Amarok out of the plane. They're poaching him because he's close to the city limits or this little town's limits. And she has to deal with that, but then she also realizes, wow, this little thing got made so that he could still protect me even though he's gone. And that's such an incredible thing. And this also flies in the face of this whole idea that art is something that we make after everything else is taken care of. This models art as something that we make to survive. And like I said, I mean, I read this when I was 8 years old, and I realized, man, I swallowed this book whole. All of that is how I feel about what art is supposed to do. Okay, now I got to move on. But, the really sad part of this is that she goes to see her father, and she's there for 5 minutes. She has to introduce herself as Julie Ann Mayax, and he says how much she's grown, and he instantly takes a phone call. He tells his new wife to fix food for her. Again, she's envisioned where her father lives, and she's cased out this town, and she watches until she gets some evidence that he lives where she thinks he's going to live, and she's really pretty right. She's got it narrowed down to 2 houses before she's ever even seen the place. He tells his wife to fix her some food. He leaves the room. This is 5 minutes after her reunion with him. They both leave the room, and she looks around, and she sees there's a jacket and a pilot's helmet, and she realizes her father. And one of the first things he says to her is, you got to go to school. She realizes her father is the one who pilots the planes that lets the people poach or hunt out of the back of the plane. She immediately leaves. This is 3 pages before the end of the book. And she goes back to her camp, and she has to bury this bird that she's been carrying with her. It just dies at that point, too. It's this lame bird, and she doesn't eat it. She carries it in her jacket all the time. And she sings a song about how the hour of the Eskimo and the wolf is over. So sad. It's so sad. My daughter, we couldn't even read that part together. I had to let her read it by herself, and I had to read it by myself. It had to be a very private moment. And then I was just reading again. I always thought that meant, and so she's gone back out, and that I think she's just going to be the holdout. But in fact, she makes her bed, and she puts her boots facing towards her father's house. And I was reading a review, and everybody's like, yeah, she returns to her father. And I was like, what? No, she does not. I always had it in my head, as many times as I've read this, is that she does not go back. But the interpretation is that she accepts the fact that her hour and the wolf's hour is over, and she returns to her father. Anyway, and then around this time, I discovered these things. They're called tupelaks. And again, I did not know about these. It's funny how these things all bubble up, and you guys probably see this with your creative work, too. My dad sent this thing. It's from the Calypso log, the Cousteau Society newsletter. And a tupelak describes a wide variety of small figures which represent either mythical or spiritual creatures. It was an avenging monster fabricated by a practitioner of witchcraft or shamanism by various objects such as an animal part bone, skin, hair, sinew, and even the parts taken from corpses. The creature was given life by ritualistic chants. It was then placed into the sea to seek and destroy a specific enemy. No original tupelaks remain, which makes you wonder, what is this really? So supposedly, nobody ever saw these things. I mean, they existed only to create this spell, and I love the idea of a work of something like this. That just, again, that just completely contradicts how we think about art in a way. But they're always like this, even though, and how truthful are these? I don't know. It's like in this realm of fiction that just intrigues me. But you can look them up online. They're always, even these remade tupolaks are extremely strange, made out of bone. And that relates to the potency of the material as much as anything. Discovered these at the same time too. These are these little ivory mannequins from the 1600s. I think it's because I was interested in making these, and people were like, well, that's weird, Rebecca. Where is this coming from? And so I started looking like, where is it coming from? And then I started discovering all these things. So these are these little medical mannequins. They're never larger than the size of your hands. There's supposedly less than 100 of these in existence. Duke University has a couple of these, evidently. I want to go down and see them. I love this guy. I was like, whoa, okay, this is somebody making it up for sure. These little homunculi, I guess, the little men that are inside of you. I was even thinking about that. I was like, that would be super creepy if I actually thought little men were running my body. But then if you think about bacteria, that's little things that run your body, so it's not that creepy. And actually, you know, the latest science on bacteria, I hope this is credible, is that depending on how much bacteria you have in your body, it changes your personality. Like if you don't have enough good bacteria in you, you're going to be timid, you're not going to interact. It actually changes how you interact if you don't have enough good bacteria in you. And then this one was somewhere in between description, you know, descriptive of innards and these really stylized, well, you've clearly never seen them in real life, but they're supposed to illustrate it. The majority of these do depict women with a fetus typically. So it's thought that really these were sort of like little midwife models, tiny ones that would fit in your hand. And so this is a piece called Firmament, where I don't know if this was my second doll, but basically it was you know, a mother and baby doll. And this is more like a mannequin that I had seen, an Asian one. I had seen one of these that went around. Beautiful mannequin. I didn't include a picture of it because it's pretty actually graphic. It's about half-life sized, but they've given her real hair and glass eyes, and she's spooky. And I think she's wonderful, but yeah, she was a medical mannequin, and then she went around in Japan. She was used mostly as sort of a freak sideshow in carnivals and things. And so Firmament is actually in this. I always like things so that you can practically miss them. And then all of this other material floating around, piece of a life cast, another depiction of the doll. And this was at a show that Karine arranged for us at the Stanton Augusta Art Center. This one is Milk Cloud. So far, for every single one of these, I've used this exact same piece of bone that I, you know, it's all off the same skull. And in this one, I have this woman depicted as the landscape. So the mountain range is growing off of her shoulder, and the figure and the animated doll. And this one is called Air Trance. And this is off of a Ben Marcus. And in this one, at this point, I was aware of now Tupolak and those medical mannequins. And so this one is very specifically designed to not necessarily, her motion isn't her function, her motion is her meaning, if that makes any sense. So in other words, her arm can move, and this leg, her trespasser leg, all of these guys are trespassers, and these are related to the walks where I found this initial bone, going out, just walking off my own property. I just never thought I could walk off my own property. And then one day I was standing down at the edge of it, and I was like, you can step over that line. It's not real. And so I go on these long walks, and it really upset my mother-in-law mostly that I was doing this, and she told my daughter, you're trespassers. And I said to my daughter, I'm like, well, do you not want to go? Do you want to just, if this bothers you, if you think this is a moral thing, then you're off the hook. But she continued to go on these with me, and in fact, I live in the country, and basically this has become my way of knowing my neighborhood. And there's only been one person who said to me, and I actually asked them directly, can I walk across your property, because I know my house is 10 minutes away, there's a thunderstorm coming, it'll take me 20 minutes to walk around. And the woman was like, no. And the husband was like, yeah. And so I just don't walk on that property. But most everybody else has been super nice. Like this one woman came running out of her house, same thing, thunderstorm rolling up, and she goes, I thought she was going to go, get off my property. And she goes, do you need a ride? There's a thunderstorm coming. She was going to like drive me home. And then other people that I've met on these walks have invited my daughter to, every year, have started inviting her to these little Easter egg hunts. So in some ways, everybody, I'm a fixture now in my neighborhood, and only one person has got really upset about me walking to do this. It makes sense. There are no sidewalks. I would have to go out on a busy road, or have to follow these fence lines. So I'm very respectful. I always follow the fence lines. But I can go like 10 miles out now. I've walked that far, which is a nice thing to be able to do, because before that, I always felt like I had to drive 40 minutes up into the park to walk. And I live in the country. So off to one side of that, which you can barely see, is this teeny weeny little peephole. And in the peephole, can you guys see there's a bed? Can we turn off the lights for just 1 second so that we can, okay. Off to one side, there's this little bed with a tree going through it. It's hard to see, but it's actually in this water, the stream. I cannot see that at all there. Anyway, it's in there, trust me. Maybe in the next one. Maybe you can see it better. Yeah, you can see that it's in this stream, and then it's beyond this fence. And this is a micro miniature. This is in a half of an Easter egg. That's what the scene is in. So that the depth of that piece is only about 3 inches, and that's embedded into that piece. So that, again, it's one of these things you could miss it easily, but it's part of the narrative of that piece. The writing out of that it's from Ben Marcus. And I was just rereading this. And so the other thing is, too, you saw that reflection. Basically, what you would have to do to read it is you'd have to do this ghost thing where you would move that plexi back and forth to focus the lines as you would read it, or you try to read the minuscule writing that's making the projection. Does that make sense? It's as that shadow falls across the piece, the image it's sharp where at the start, and then it's blurry at the beginning. So if you were to read just the shadow, you would have to make this kind of ghost book kind of thing and just read each line, focus it to read it down the line. But anyway, in rereading this is Julie of the Wolves again. I mean, it's the same thing. These are the words from a book called The Age of Wire and String. If the motion of the wind were to be slowed, as weather is slowed briefly when an animal is born, we would notice a man building and destroying his own house. If we speak to the man through a dense rain, our speech is menaced by the drowning method, and we appear to him to be people that are angry and shouting. If my father is the man we are looking at, he will shout back at me, protecting the house with his hand, and his voice will blend with whatever weather he has decided to create in the sky between us to form a small, hard animal which, once inside me, will take slow, measured, strategic bites. The animal's eating project will produce in others the impression that I am kneeling, lying, or fading in an area of total rain, taking shelter behind my upraised hand. Since they will be standing above me, the people will need to request special powers of vision, which will be immediately granted in order that I appear in slow, original colors, viewed from any possible perspective, chewing with great care at my own body while the house gets smashed behind me. So this book written as prose, but it's poetry, and it creates this kind of feeling of this kind of post-apocalyptic place. Greg and I proposed to bring him here as a Wampler, he had just won a Berlin Prize, and he's winning everything now. Guggenheim, he's inaccessible. We can no longer. We were dealing with an agent, and then we were like, this isn't going to work out after all. But yeah, so it's really, his star is definitely rising. And, this is strange stuff, but I feel like when I realized how well this ended up paired, and I did not make the figure to illustrate the words, they just went together. I realized, wow, this is the same sort of thing coming up again and again and again. So, so going back to the dream imagery, this is an actual place, and this is imagery I use over and over again. I built it because, I had this in a dream where I was in this dream with either my daughter or my sister, and it was like we had parachuted down from somewhere because there was this tattered parachute over us. We laid down on this moss, and I was like, I'm so warm, even though it's cold. And I just remembered the image. So I actually went ahead and built this in my yard, this bed around a tree, this young oak tree. And then, so strange how things sort of come out that I'm doing. My daughter and I talk about stuff, and sometimes it seems like stuff happens simultaneously between us. I decided I was going to build this burrow as part of a piece, and she sort of simultaneously was digging this burrow out in the yard. And she did these little drawings, and it ended up in a quilt of her in her little burrow. But she actually tried to dig it, and she did get it to the point where she could crouch down and be hidden in this thing, and then kind of gave up on it. But I built this little miniature burrow as my studio to go under this tree. And this all ties back in with earlier work. This is as I was building it. So, and this actually looks, all of these things that are in this burrow are stuff that sort of look like my apartment when I kept an apartment here. And this is what it looks like through the lens. And so these are the journals. These are my journals, which I've just obsessed with. I have journals. I keep journals. I'm uncomfortable if I don't have my journal. And so, you know, when I got this talk here, there was this kind of thing where it got buried, the journals got buried underneath this tree. Not really, but the tree, the symbol of the tree and the magic is really what I was after there. Here it is in this upright sort of podium. But then if you go around to the back, this is the lens box that has the burrow, which is my studio. And above it is the tree, this crabapple tree that is in our yard. And on the tree, you could totally miss it, is this little embryo fruit. The tree is a music box. So you wind the tree up, and it spins around, and it plays this very sad lullaby about, you know, when you wake, you'll have all the pretty horses. The second verse is way down in the meadow, there's a poor little lamb, the birds and flies pecking out its eyes. You know, and it's basically, it's the mammy taking care of the white baby singing this song. And that was always hummed to me, only the first verse, or sung to me. And I had this made as a music box, and they very kindly put a drive on this thing. And so this actually functions as a music box, and it has this teeny weeny little thing. Another motif that I've been carrying on for years. This was the original supposed embryo fruit, which is in fact frozen applesauce that I had to photograph very quickly. I just froze it into a cast, and it really looks like a carved pear, because people are like, you did not carve that. And I'm like, no, I did not carve that. I cast that, it's frozen, and it melted. So, but again, my daughter, just the way she picks up on things, I don't think that I'm not showing it to her. I'm not like, look, baby, this is what I have going on right now. She drew this, she was 3 years old, spontaneously on one of our blackboards, and that is Mommy, Daddy, Rosalie in the embryo fruit. And then this was the thank you note when I got this job here to everybody, because that was part of my presentation. And then this has 2 incarnations, which I like the idea of remaking the same thing over and over again in certain incarnations. So this is the tower, and then the tower has this other incarnation. This one's called the birds and the flies. The other incarnation of it is I Waited for You, But You Never Came, which is from a Radiohead song. And it's burned down. And that's from the front and the back. There's the tree again with the bed with the tree growing through it. And then everybody's like, they think that I raided the original burrow to make this burrow. No, I didn't. I reproduced every bit of it again. So it's 2 separate complete things, only this time it's kind of falling in. And this has got an LED in the trash can that sets it on fire. This all predates the doll work. This is not in order. This is another little interior made of a flooded auditorium, and I just had the urge to do this, and it's only been shown once in Norfolk. And actually, as I was making this, well, as we were driving it down to install it, a hurricane was coming ashore, and I thought, wow, my exhibition's going to be flooded, and I conjured something here that I probably don't really want to have happen. It's only been shown once. The optics in this were not good. I like the idea. I'm going to revisit it, but this one didn't really super work. This water is gel wax, which is this really cool stuff that looks exactly like water, but it's wax, and it just looks exactly like water. But the temperature that you melt it at is very close to the temperature that it burns at, so it's kind of dangerous to work with. This is my grandmother's house, and this is leading up to the final thing that I'm going to show you guys, this piece called Ulysses. And my grandmother lived in Montgomery, Maryland. She was clearly an artist herself, sculptor. She built this house when starting at the time she was my age, roughly, with her 2 sons, but later by herself, every bit of it. And it's very quirky, and hence it was impossible to sell when she passed away. You know, my understanding is if it's not torn down, it's about to be torn down, which is very sad to me because it was such a quirky house, and you guys will see as I go through these. Like her bathtub, above her bathtub, this is something she did in 1 or 2 days. She carved this mermaid and all these scenes, and, you know, cement dries quickly. She never finished it. This was always unfinished, but it was about 2 days worth of work of this sort of underwater scene. The whole house was like that. So it was always discovery for me. Like, for instance, around one door frame, she carved everything, like the door frames. You know, the wood cracked, and so she'd carve something to incorporate the crack into it, like some, you know, flower or something. So the whole house was like that, extremely quirky, everything made, you know, from the ground up, everything. And she was about my size, but her arms were like Arnold Schwarzenegger. She had these like arms, like you cut them off of somebody else and put them on her. So this is her backyard. And then this is facing south. But she died in 2008. Before that, I had this dream that my friend Martha, who's sitting here in the room with us, we were at her house, and Martha got up on a stepladder, and she painted above the window in my grandmother's, what would have been her winter studio facing east, which is, if you would just do the quarter turn here, that's what you would be facing on the other side of this piano. And she painted Ulysses, and I never really understood what that meant, but I liked the imagery because Ulysses is the Latin version of Odysseus, and I just took that to mean because it was in my grandmother's house, and it framed this picture window, so a picture window just like what you're looking at out there. I always took it to mean that we're on the Odyssey. Artists are, you know, travelers. I always liked the image, and then after my grandmother died, when I was on leave 2 years ago, I went back to her house, and it was pretty much everything was gone out of it. But in that studio room, there was books, and I was standing at a distance, and I'm like, I bet Ulysses is on the top of that pile. And I walked over, and Ulysses, the book by James Joyce, was on the top of that pile. And so I had to make the piece of my grandmother's winter studio with Ulysses. And then one thing that she always kept in the window of her studio was this, and this is sort of rounding it off with toys now, is this little toy that my dad made when he was little, about 3 years old. It's depicted here. It's hard to see. In a jar. I always called it a ship in a bottle. It now sits in the window of my studio. This is what it is. It's in this jar. It's not a ship in a bottle. It's just this little boat that my dad made supposedly when he was 3 years old on a piece of balsa wood. It fits very easily in there. I recreated this for this and put it in a bigger jar. But when I was working on it, I lost it. I lost the little boat because I went to get a dental tool, and I came back and I looked for this thing for like an hour. Honestly, I quadranted it off my table. I looked under it, and I just gave up. I'm like, I can't find it. I'm going to have to remake it. And then I went back to work on this little room, and all of a sudden I could totally see it was exactly where I had left it. And so, in other words, I was blind for an hour because I changed my whole mindset to go look for a tool. And then it took me an hour to get back to the place where I could see that thing again. So I just wanted to finish with this quote from On Longing about, play and interior worlds. In its tableau-like form, the miniature is a world of arrested time. Its stillness emphasizes the activity that is outside its borders. And this effect is reciprocal, for once we attend to the miniature world, the outside world stops and is lost to us. And it does work in reverse. You can lose that little teeny world so fast. You got to be in there. It's like it's invisible. It was invisible. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. I hope I didn't go too far over. I did go way over, didn't I? Oh, well. If you guys have any questions, I didn't address camera stuff too much. Does anybody have any questions about that? Yeah.
Have you seen the throne rooms at the Art Institute in Chicago?
I think I've seen them in.
Sorry.
I think they're like little miniature, like.
Miniature, like interiors.
Right, I've seen representations of those, but I haven't seen them in real life. I've been to the Rijksmuseum to see their little miniature dollhouses, and they're amazing. Yeah, and then like that stuff was collected by really wealthy women originally. That was not for children. It's sort of become the domain of children, but and those little teeny weeny replicas, true to life, cost more than the their full-size counterparts. A lot of them, because they're so.
They have reproductions of a lot of like the large paintings that are upstairs.
Oh, that's awesome! I love that.
It's so magical that they were able to reproduce them that way.
Yeah. And if you guys are interested in reading up more on this, like actually the book on longing talks about the fact that our sense of time is expanded and constricted according to scale. We think that that's an absolute, what time is. But if you're looking at something that's on a smaller scale, your sense of time will be actually shrunk in proportion to whatever you're looking at, which is amazing. And I think really a good, truthful example of this is if anybody's ever seen the puppets, the Royal Deluxe puppets, those giant puppets from France. Has anybody seen those? They take a whole day to unfold a storyline. And there's this one thing on YouTube where there's this embrace of this uncle and the girl. These are these giant marionettes. It takes like 12 people to run this thing, and she moves so slow. And I mean, it would be so painful to watch somebody our size watch it, but this embrace happens, and it takes forever. It takes 10 minutes for that. I mean, this crane is lifting this little doll, and she's not little, she's huge, and into the arms of this, and at the exact moment, I just love that the exact moment where it becomes an embrace, everybody in the crowd, and I love that everybody recognizes it at the exact same moment, and it's so painful, it takes so long. They all go, yay, and oh, and, it's just like the crowd just erupts right when that happens. It's spectacular. But if you would have people do that, our scale, it would be meaningless. It's like the meaning would just fall away from that whole slow embrace. And when is it really the embrace that makes everybody clap? It's sudden. It's fabulous. Anyway, you can watch some of that on YouTube. I don't think they've ever been to the United States. I think they were maybe going to come to the United States, but they've been all over the world. I think the closest they've ever come is to Mexico. And I think they do like one thing a year, but it's incredible. It takes all day for one of these performances to happen, and people are indulgent. They will, because their sense of time is totally changed watching this. But it happens correspondingly on a small scale as well. It's a different, it becomes this kind of different psychological world. Any other questions? No?
So text is obviously really important. And I'm just wondering more about that sort of relationship between image and text. And how it seems to start with text and then go to image. Like you read something and then you create it or you reinterpret it, and I'm just wondering more about that relationship.
Well, I mean, I think at least with the Julia and the Wolves stuff, I realized that, it does sort of, for me, it seems like stuff sort of happens simultaneously to a spooky extent, because it's hard for me to say if one thing influenced me. But again, I feel like that particular book, I've been cooking for years and just honoring and letting that, and I think it coming out of me again corresponds to my daughter being the same age. It's like all of a sudden I had access to that again, and it appeared, my access appeared as, she brought home a Newbery Award winner. I reread this one that I loved. I forgot everything about that book except for eating the bottoms of the grass. I forgot all about the dogs. I forgot all that. I mean, again. So, but then that one part about where she makes that little effigy, I was like, okay, this totally makes sense to let stuff cook, and to feel that art is not this thing that's something we do when all our other needs are taken care of. It's essential, and it's sort of, just that model of art was so important for me to reread. But the Ben Marcus stuff, yeah, that remade world too. I did carry that book around. I don't think I made that doll to go with the writing. I was making the doll anyway. I forgot to point out that, yeah, her main function is to have that one arm that always passes through her own body, through her spinal cord. And that was a very kind of deliberate, conscious, I mean, the bones told me how to do it, but also that was a conscious desire to make a doll that became meaning, not function. And so her passing her hand through her own body is supposed to be about, for me, self-awareness, not self-involvement, but self-awareness. And so that's her function, is to be self-aware. Yeah, I don't know if people get that necessarily, but
Can you explain meaning, not function?
well, she can't work as a doll. If you look at her, she does not work. So she has to work just at the level of meaning. So her one leg works, and her arm works, and her head works, and she's got all these details. She's human, but her main function is to have that arm that passes through her own body, and to be this little amulet kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, and that's where I sort of stopped working on those. And actually, they're an incredible strain to work on because headaches, just working at that scale, really, really small. I use visors, which make me look like a total goofball. But even after you take off these magnifying visors, it's hard to really even just focus across the room. So it's way more taxing for me to make something small and to make something, whoops, did you guys hear that? Sorry, I just slapped your little, yeah, it's hard to make something that's that small. And I want to get back to it, but my vision's at the age that I'm at is changing. So it might be one of these things where I feel optimistic because, in fact, almost every project I work on, I have to learn new skills. And so I'm perfectly okay if my next project takes me to a new skill set. Because, I mean, that's hard for me to sell to people because they look at all this work and they're like, this doesn't fit together. Because probably what I'm really do mostly is this 19th century processes. And that's what people come to expect from me. But then I have all this other weirdness. And I think I just, my whole mode of working is to, every time I have a story, which is the important thing, is to change my skill sets, to learn my new skill sets. So, but it does all sort of, I think, relate to photography, because I love how photography is the pivot point of art and science. And, you know, it was even early on, lots of people were very hopeful for it as a spiritual tool as well, and I'm sort of fascinated by that. And it's not like that's done either, because Nancy Burson went way out there with that stuff. I mean, she's the person that's known for the digital, creating those digital composites that will age somebody that go on she worked for Harvard. She got really crazy into ECs. What does that stand for again, Corrine?
Yeah, what is that?
Extra celestial. And her website had all this stuff, and she would claim these little blobs of light in these photographs were people's from, and she was serious. I think she was serious. But it's not there so much anymore. Now she's merging, like she's trying to create the ubiquitous, the face of all humanity by merging all these pictures. Yeah, Nancy Burson.
Yeah.
She went crazy out there for a while, like nutty. So, anyway. All right, pardon?
It might have been true.
Well, okay. I guess. It's hard to prove. Let's just put it that way. Anyway. Any other questions? Comments?
At least one student has a question. I know a student has a question.
Some of you guys
No
know
pressure,
me.
though.
Some of you
But a
guys know
student
me.
definitely
Here's
has a
Jet. Jet right under you wants to ask something.
See?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the camera lens to create like the smooth view of the image.
Yeah, it's not always a camera lens, but for instance, the one that is in the Ulysses piece, Dimph put that. I just had decided I was going to do it. This is how these things happen. I just decided I was going to make that piece the day before, and Dimph sent me this email, and she said, "I put a lens on your desk. I wonder if you can use it." And as soon as I looked at that thing, I was like, "Oh my gosh." You know how long I would have had to look on eBay to find something this perfect? This would have been like 2 weeks off my project to try to find something like, and I still might not have found it because the optics can make or break it. But anyway, this is a gorgeous Leica or lights enlarging lens. And so the focus of it is, if you look directly in it, the focus of it is like 3 or 4 inches ahead, but if you get to 5 inches, it's out of focus. But then if you step back from that lens, the further you step back, it's an enlarging lens, the bigger that scene becomes. And so if you stand across the room, you look like, it feels like you're looking into a real sized room, and I love that. You can't see any details, of course. You know, you can just sort of see out the window and a little bit of the fence. You can't see the details, but it gives the illusion of you looking into a real room through a lens. So, yeah, not always camera lenses. That was an enlarging lens. Yeah.
We're just starting to talk about it. Just curious about your practice as far as do you work more like a Joseph Cornell, like as far as where your materials are coming from? Like how do you kind of navigate what you hunt online and what you pull out of your yard?
Okay. Well, yeah. Yeah. My grandma's house, times 10. Whole school building. We have a whole elementary school, and it's so loaded with stuff. I'm a little sick over it because part of me is I have all this stuff, and it was so sad to watch how my grandmother's stuff just went out helter-skelter. You know, she didn't want to deal with it, and my dad and my uncle didn't want to deal with it. And so one of the very first things that happened when she died is like, yeah, people just basically, who didn't have permission to go in there, or maybe they sort of didn't honor any of where she wanted that stuff to go. It just went out completely helter-skelter. And so part of one of my big second half of my life things is where is this going to go? If it's not going to go and work, it's got to go somewhere else. I have everything in the entire world in my home, and usually within 4 feet of me. So if I stand anywhere and I just do this, it's there. Which makes it sound very crowded, but it also is that I think if we honor our processes of how we make, I pick up stuff, and then sometimes 4 years later, that's when I need it. That's when I want it. And that's usually right there. And I just have to see it to know, oh, I don't have to buy stuff. I really am at the point where I don't need to buy stuff anymore. And I should actually make that a rule. No more buying anything ever, again, ever. So just get rid of it. Use it or get rid of it. So, yeah, because I definitely want to spend, again, I hope it's the second 50 years of my life making sure that every little bead goes to the right place, doesn't end up broken on the ground or bulldozed or whatever for all that work that my grandmother did. So, yeah. Good question, though. Again, but this is like 50 years of doing it. I'm way more accepting of how things unfold for me, which is not always easy because I think academia wants us to produce at a certain rate. But sometimes my stuff takes a long time, cooks for a really long time. And probably all of us do, but I don't want to make filler anymore either, because I've done a lot of that as well. Made filler that's just stuff now I have to just get rid of. So, yeah, I want it to all have meaning, so. Yeah.
What's the significance behind working so small? It kind of has this very sentimental air to it, which kind of harkens back to why you make the pieces in period. But why do you make them small for you?
Yeah, and I think that's part of it too, is just like these contradictions in my personality of I have all this stuff, I have all this baggage in a way, but part of me just wants to be free of it and just exist without having to need all this stuff. And again, this is aging for sure. But the other sort of interesting thing is, again, not willfully. I've been keeping journals for years. I write almost every single day. My writing has gone from this big fat writing it's always been sloppy, takes up a lot of room, to it's now so small and almost microscopic that I can barely, it's difficult to read. It gives me a headache to read it. I can write it. I can't read it anymore. And so it's funny because when I was in Vienna with Tate, one of the students was behind me, and he goes, "Oh, you missed a spot," because I fill every speck of every little bit. I never let any of the white exist anymore. It's there. So it takes me like probably 5 days of writing, but I write every day. 5 days of writing to fill a page, and when I transcribe it, which I do occasionally, man, it's a lot of writing. It's compulsive, and it's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think that's just a kind of way to satisfy the contradiction of, I don't want to take up ton of space anymore. I already take up a ton of space. So, and I feel kind of guilty about that. Because the other thing, again, that's in that book that I think that it's, again, one of the things that I swallowed whole was the fact that that girl is 13 years old. She's fictitious, maybe, but she never is lonely. She never is sad or scared. That really stood out to me. What she needs is going to come to her. She's smart about it. She's observant, but she doesn't have to carry everything with her to be happy. And one of the things that she does is she sings, and she's always singing to herself. And they write these little passages of poetry, and she makes that little object. It just shows, for me, that illustrates just how little stuff we actually need to get along. And then also, and again, this is a contradiction, also that art in every form is so important to our well-being. So I definitely believe in that, but I have to work on those contradictions. Yeah.
I'm wondering how you find balance, because it seems like because the work is so small, you can really get lost in it. And I know with my own work I can, and I can completely spend a whole day and forget to cook dinner for my son, and if that happens, and how you find a balance with involving your daughter in making the work.
I have a family that works out really well, meaning that I have a husband, and the trade-off of having my mother-in-law live with us is that she is a built-in babysitter, which is pretty awesome. She's lived with us since my daughter was 6. She has, she's in a building behind us, but for many years she lived in the building with us, and that was very taxing to have her take over a lot of the things that I would have liked to have done. Like, she did all the cooking, and but we survived that, and yeah, having other people on the scene. But I think it's kind of magical. I don't know if your son does this, and I don't know if all kids do this. My daughter always just falls in with whatever I'm doing without me having to say to her, oh, I'm working on this. She just always sort of does her own parallel thing, which is, I think, miraculous at times. A sort of oversight that I made, though, however, I say this, is that I never told her how a darkroom operated. And so this one time I was in my darkroom with all of my tintype plates set out, and she brought me flowers, and she held the door open with her foot. And she's like, Bobby, I brought you flowers. And I was like, because all my stuff was lost. I'm like, that's really dumb to not tell your kid that you don't come in a dark room when somebody's in the dark room working. She just didn't understand that at all. So she's super careful about it now. She asks about it anytime she goes into that room. So I think it's like sometimes our kids get us and work alongside of us. Or maybe I'm just crazy, crazy, stupid lucky. It could be that as well. It feels that way at times because she's so much a part of it. Doesn't want to be an artist, though, not at all. She's, she wants to do science. She wants to go into the sciences. So, but yeah, she's all into the whole mythology. It's all there. She does not love Julie of the Wolves. She's like, Mom, that's just way too sad. I'm like, I thought she would love this book. She doesn't love it. So she has her own things that she loves, for sure. Anyway. Anything else?
Last question.
Thanks,
All
you
right,
guys.
let's thank Rebecca.
Yay, thank you all.